yeah, great to be following Will and Vanessa's talk, and thank you again for this opportunity as well to present at the working group. So I have a pretty short presentation, just a few slides here on a project that we started this year, 2021, and looking at the effects of drought on old growth cedar and hemlock in central BC. So just to sort of locate our project, this map shows the distribution of cedar in green, and the red circle is our general study area. And so you can see that our study is really occurring at the northern margins of cedar distribution in the interior of the province. And it's coincidentally, it's right at that area where Will's model is suggesting that the distribution of cedar may expand with climate change. So this summer we established, we collected data from 26 cedar hemlock stands, and we'll talk a lot more about what we did there. And our study at this point is focused on cedar in two subzones, the wet cool and the very wet cool subzones. Just a little bit more context for this project. In the Amanika region, just east of it's around Prince George, I should say, we've experienced 4 pretty significant drought events in the past decade, like many of you in the interior, 2014, 17 and 18, and then of course the heat event of this summer, 2021. 2014 was the driest summer on record, according to the Prince George Airport climate data going back to 1943. And 17 and 18 were also very dry growing seasons. And then 2021 was, of course, the temperature, all sorts of temperature records were broken in this region. And concurrent with these events, there has been increasing amounts of drought damage to cedar noted in this area. It's localized, but it does appear to be increasing. And so just for this presentation, I looked at the Forest Health Survey data that the province conducts every year. And in 2019, the province mapped about 40,000 hectares of drought damage to cedar in the Prince George timber supply area. And in 2020, another 40,000 hectares were mapped as well. The photo on the left just shows an example of what that might look like from the air. So you can see lots of red foliage in a localized cedar stand, and this happens to be located in the Caribou Mountains. I should mention as well that there is some hemlock looper in the region, and there's also some suggestions that some of this red cedar flagging may be related to winter desiccation. So what appears to be drought may not always be in this region. A few more photos just of the drought in this region. These were taken from a drone last summer, and I'm not sure how well that shows up on your screen, but at any rate, this photo was taken about 45 minutes east of Prince George, and hopefully you can see that there's a substantial amount of red cedar and hemlock trees in the stand, a fair number of gray trees as well. So we didn't notice a lot of mortality, but certainly lots of red foliage and lots of thinning crowns. Looking a little closer, now hopefully those two cedar in the foreground, you can see that this is sort of very common now. What we're seeing in some of these stands is just thin foliage, or the trees have lost most of their foliage in the upper crowns, and what's remaining is quite red. And just a last photo here, this is actually of a hemlock, but just showing that typical drought symptom where much of the foliage has died in the upper crown. So there's top kill, and with green foliage down lower. So I'd be curious actually to hear if folks in other parts of the province are seeing similar drought symptoms in their cedar and hemlock stands as well. But this, all this drought damage has got us thinking now in our region at least, and given now the real focus on old growth and all the values that we derive from these old growth stands, is what are the implications now of droughts or future droughts on structure in these forests, in cedar hemlock forests. Climate projections are largely forecasting an increase in drought magnitude and severity. So our questions are what does this, or how will these stands, I guess, respond? The specific question we're hoping to answer with this question is, can we look at historical responses of cedar and hemlock trees to droughts in the past, and can this help inform our understanding around how they might respond in the future? So we're going to take a tree ring based approach to this. So we're going to use just tree cores, a conventional sort of tree ring approach to quantify resilience in cedar and hemlock stands. So just the photo here I'm showing, this is much like Vanessa's presentation. This is a core that we collected from a cedar tree east of Prince George this summer. And you can see the annual rings. And I've just happened to highlight 3 rings that correspond to drought events in the past decade. And so our whole question is can we use these tree rings to help understand tree level resilience to drought? I'll just take a few minutes to quantify describe what I mean by resilience. I think the term resilience is probably familiar to many of you on the call. But I want to talk a little bit about our approach of using tree rings as a measure of resilience. And again, this might be something that's familiar to some of you, but at any rate, this approach really gained prominence, I think, in 2011 with a paper that was published by Francesco Loret and others, where they proposed that we can actually use radial growth patterns as a way to understand a tree's resilience to some sort of a climatic event like a drought. And so the figure in the center of the screen is just showing a hypothetical radial growth pattern for a given tree over 3 different periods. So one would be the pre-drought period. You can see a large growth decline associated with a drought, and then you can see growth resuming after the drought. And so the idea here is that we can break resilience down into different components and measure those using tree rings. So for example, we can quantify the resistance of a tree to a drought, to a given drought, by just comparing its growth decline in the year of the drought to how it was growing before the drought. We can also quantify then recovery after a drought by just comparing a tree's radial growth or productivity after the drought, comparing that again to the growth decline that it experienced during the drought. And then the metric that I'm probably most interested in is this one they term as resilience. And this is simply comparing, or this is, I guess, quantitatively answering the question is, was the tree able to fully recover from that given drought event? So this is the framework we're going to use when analyzing our tree ring data that was collected this summer. As I said, this paper published in 2011, it seems to be now, the framework and this approach seems to be an emerging field of study in the dendro world. I'm reading more and more papers that have applied these metrics to tree ring data sets to understand tree resilience to drought. And up until now, I've read mostly, or I've seen this approach applied to Douglas fir or ponderosa pine forest. I haven't come across anybody that has applied it to a cedar or a hemlock forest yet. So I'm curious how it will hold up in our stands. Our hypothesis here is that resilience to drought, so these metrics that we estimate for these trees, is going to vary with species, and it will vary with soil moisture regime. So we assume or we expect that hemlock and cedar will vary in how they respond to a given drought event. And we also expect that, for example, cedar trees growing on a dry site or a xeric site, as Will pointed out, where they may be less feasible, they will respond to drought differently than cedar trees growing on a wetter site or maybe a more of a subhydric site. So I'll just illustrate that a little bit by sharing some photos of the stands where we collected data this summer. So as I mentioned before, we had 26 stands that we sampled in, cedar hemlock stands. The photo on the left is showing a cedar tree that Kristen is coring in a subhydric site, so a rich site dominated by devil's club. It was not fun to work in there. I think that's the largest tree we cored this summer. It was just over 2.5 meters diameter. In comparison then to the photo on the right, which is the cedar tree growing on more of a mesic site. So here we have more oak fern with scattered devil's club. And then lastly, these were the sort of the driest sites where we could find cedar. This is kind of a sub-xeric site. It's just basically exposed and broken bedrock covered with feather moss. The stand is dominated, as you can see, by hemlock, but there are scattered mature cedar in here. So this is, in our region anyways, this appears to be the dry limits of where cedar can occupy a dominant or co-dominant crown position. And presumably, again, cedar on this site, on these kinds of sites, will respond to drought differently than cedar on the wetter sites that I showed previously. This approach is based on research that we've done in this area on different tree species. So this winter, we published a paper where we looked at this question in subalpine fir and spruce forests around Prince George. And the figure I'm showing here is for 15 subalpine fir populations. And the units themselves aren't too important, but basically what we did is we quantified population level sensitivity to drought. And then we arrayed that over soil moisture regime on the x-axis. And what we found is that subalpine fir growing at its dry limits in our region on the driest sites where we can find it, as you might expect, was the most sensitive to summer drought. And then that sensitivity varies somewhat coherently over the gradient of soil moisture regime. So our question is, will we see similar relationship in cedar and hemlock stands? So we started this project in the spring, and as I've said, we've collected data now from 26 stands. Our stands span soil moisture regimes in the different subzones from sub-xeric to subhydric. We've collected roughly 600 cores. And I should also mention that the University of Northern BC here in Prince George will also be measuring stable carbon isotope ratios in annual rings for a subset of 40 cedar trees. So there is some evidence that stable carbon isotopes can also indicate the level of drought stress in trees. And so we're going to use those data to sort of corroborate what we're finding with the tree rings in cedar trees as well. Just to go on somewhat of a tangent here, I think for next year, we're going to start exploring the use of remote sensing to understand and map cedar drought in our region as well. One of the issues that we faced with this project is that we're really unable to quantify the amount of drought damage in each stand that we sampled. It's just simply too hard to assess crown symptoms. But it does appear that we might be able to do this using satellite imagery. And so the image on the lower right side of your screen is the Sentinel-2 satellite image taken from this summer. And you can see that there's various shades of green and red and yellow. And it does appear that the red and the yellow line up with areas that have substantial drought damage. And so we're going to try and test this approach maybe next year, and to see if we can see how well or if there's potential to use satellite imagery to sort of quantify the amount of drought damage in the stands that we sampled, as well as potentially map out the extent of drought damage in our region. The top left image I'm showing is just some imagery that we collected using a drone. And then we enhance the saturation, and you can really see, when you do that, you can really see the trees that have red foliage or are gray and have lost most of their foliage. So we'll try and blend the two methods potentially using satellite and drone imagery. So that's basically all I wanted to share. I just wanted to acknowledge that I've received a lot of help on this project from folks, both on this project itself, but also looking at this broader topic of drought in the north. So just thanks to Kirsten, Alex, Bruce, Vanessa, and Craig.